called my Palico routine. For a long time, I have considered the union between people serves as a driving force of intellectual advancement in a species. This implies that if a few meerkats, for instance, somehow realized or discovered that another tribe of meerkats or other similar animal were living were in their own tribe 200 miles away from them, then for some of the meerkats in tribe A, it becomes their obligation to remember that there is such a tribe, imagine what the tribe is like, find resources, including other meerkats, to somehow commute between the two tribes, find out and tell its location, and then survive until the return to tribe A. The strategy forms a sort of communion with the people of tribe B, and thus tribe B would be fully knowledgeable of the people of tribe A, even without ever considering traveling to such a tribe or discovering that such a place existed. Such an act would create a body of exploration into their own imaginations, and would create ways to depict the things that they learned. This, in turn, leads to the gathering of new resources and the preservation of finished products. These efforts in the evolution of intelligence all require multiple people for the reason that if a certain being had one sort of capability, then the work that would be able to do would be multiplied by a similar fashion. This equation also works for different sorts of constructs that arise from previous discoveries. For instance, if horses decided to band together to consent to being ridden or milked, then they could decide that they did not need cages anymore. Thus, society as a whole would be slightly more advanced. Therefore, it is beneficial for a person to associate themselves in certain groups for the safety and convenience reasons. Like for instance, instead of driving a car, many people would use a bus. The bus itself is part of an even larger transit system. This means that it conserves fuel. Since now multiple people don't need separate cars, it lightens traffic. It is harder for the police to stop them for any reason, and for that reason it becomes a concern of the transit system itself, and it only requires one driver. Likewise, an apartment building is much harder to knock down, consumes less resources, and contains entire communities of people. Another example of a community organization is a nursery where children are sent to a nursery to live rather than to visit and take classes. This means that the association between a child and society does not go through their parents, but their parents of a single family unit aren't solely responsible for them, because that is not the case when the child grows up, and it causes a lot of problems between while the child is growing up under the protection of parents, and when the parents and when the child has to go and find other things to do on his own. Referring back to the previous initial example, a person could try to imagine what would happen if the amount of work required to maximally perform a task was reduced to zero. Realizing that all people are instances of the same person, then this function cannot really be zero, it can only approach zero. This means that the force being exerted on all elements of the system would be minimized by the amount a person knows about doing something or performing a task. But if one person is assigned, how do you get the case where one person is assigned to is assigned to a task in a different sort of um, skill set, whereas a person who has learned to do one set of things is then moved to a task that requires a completely different set of things. This means that the resistance in doing a task comes from the it comes from the comes becomes dependent upon the distance between the two tasks. It also means for it also means for an industry. How does an industry allow or stop a person from that does not have the skill sets for the industry to perform a certain task? Given a number of tasks, how does an industry of tasks properly secure its experience from people who are not familiar with the task in order to maximize the amount of work done by each individual people? An industry can do so only if there is a set education standard for for reaching a place in an industry. For instance, you must have demonstrated skill in a lower position first. If a promotion to a position was to be done by consent of a larger body not directly related to that industry, then that body can only consent to the selection of candidates for promotion who have worked in that industry already. These candidates must be known as reputable people who have served their people as a member of that industry for several years, and if an industry should choose to apply themselves to this policy, then they may reverse previous decisions of previous policies. For example, I relate back to the nursery again. I think children should live in nurseries or schools rather than at home. Parents can still pull their child out and change their schools, but children are much faster socialized in schools than at homes. Because the home as we know it isn't necessarily a learning environment for children. Parents must provide the learning environment within their own habitats.